Tonight, we're going to talk about why that headline matters far beyond one angry room, far beyond one congressman getting shouted down, far beyond the usual cable news cycle of viral clips and partisan dunking, because what you are watching in Alabama, yes, Alabama, the place political strategists love to treat as safe territory, the place that was supposed to be immune to buyer's remorse, is a stress fracture in the domestic foundation that great powers rely on to compete abroad. And if you understand realism, if you understand grand strategy, you know domestic cohesion is not a soft, sentimental concept. It is a hard asset. It is the base of national power. It is the fuel that turns money into capability and capability into credibility. And when that base begins to crack, rivals don't need to guess, they don't need to speculate, they simply observe and adjust. The dramatic moment that sets the tone here, reported from a town hall in which a Republican member of Congress faced boos and anger from his own constituents, matters because it reveals something that polite political discourse tries to hide. Voters are not reacting to ideology as an abstract hobby anymore. They are reacting to the cost of living, the cost of health care, the cost of electricity, the cost of instability, and they are directing that anger at the very movement that promised them strength and delivered them strain. This is the rude awakening. Politics can sell you a revolution, but it still has to pay the bill at the end of the month. And Alabama is a particularly revealing case because prolonged one-party dominance, no matter which party it is, tends to produce an echo chamber where messaging replaces performance. Leaders get rewarded for loyalty and rhetoric rather than outcomes. And then the outcomes arrive like a foreclosure notice. Hospitals strained, budgets tightened, classrooms threatened, households trapped in zero-sum choices between essentials. Now, I'm not here to litigate every statistic that gets tossed around in the heat of local politics, because in these moments, numbers become weapons, but the underlying structural logic is painfully clear. If people believe their healthcare security is shrinking, if they believe their utility bills keep climbing, if they believe their jobs and markets are being whiplashed by national policy fights like tariffs and trade shocks, they don't care how glorious the speech is. They care that life is harder. And when life gets harder in a place that was supposed to be politically loyal, that's not a messaging problem. That's a governance problem. The elite response to this kind of revolt is almost always to treat it as a PR crisis, to say the crowd was unrepresentative, to blame agitators, to dismiss the anger as misunderstanding, but realism teaches the opposite. Public anger is information, and information tells you whether the state can sustain strategy. Because foreign policy, contrary to what Washington often pretends, is not independent of domestic legitimacy. If you cannot maintain consent at home, your commitments abroad become brittle. That's the connection that's easy to ignore when the markets are stable and the headlines are calm, but impossible to ignore when voters in a deep red state start sounding like an opposition movement inside the empire. And this is where the Trump era and the broader movement around it meets its strategic contradiction. It promised America first, but many of its most visible policy instincts, when implemented without discipline, create America strained. Tariffs, for example, are not magic. They are a tax in practice. And while they can be used as leverage in carefully calibrated negotiations, they also raise costs and provoke retaliation. And the people who feel that first are often the ones farthest from the beltway. Farmers, small manufacturers, households that don't have the cushion to absorb price increases. Meanwhile, healthcare in America remains a chronic vulnerability. And when any policy shift or subsidy change threatens coverage, it hits like a strategic shock at the household level, because health insecurity is not just personal, it's economic. People delay care, emergencies become catastrophes, hospitals absorb losses, budgets get squeezed, and resentment grows. Add energy costs and utility pricing to that mix, especially in regions where climate and infrastructure make electricity consumption unavoidable, and you get exactly the dynamic that produces town halls like the one described. People feel cornered, and when people feel cornered, they stop applauding slogans and start demanding answers. The real strategic insight here is that domestic decay invites external pressure, not because rivals are evil cartoon characters, but because the international system is is competitive and opportunistic. Beijing and Moscow do not need to love your suffering to benefit from it. They simply need to notice that your political class is fighting itself more than it is solving problems, that your public trust is eroding, that your policy swings are unpredictable, that your coalition building at home is harder, and therefore your staying power abroad is uncertain. Great powers look for windows. They look for moments when the dominant power is distracted, divided, or overextended. And the United States has been flirting with all three conditions at once: enormous commitments overseas, internal polarization that makes consistent strategy difficult, and a governing culture that often prioritizes symbolic conflict over material performance. So when you see a senator or a national figure respond to serious civil liberty concerns with language that sounds dismissive, mistakes happen. That's the price we pay. Don't put yourself in that situation. That's not just an ugly political moment. It's a signal of institutional drift, because stable democracies do not normalize the idea that ordinary people must live in fear of arbitrary state action. When that normalization starts, the regime's legitimacy begins to rot from inside. And legitimacy, again, is not a moral flourish. It is a strategic asset. When legitimacy weakens, governance becomes coercion by default, and coercion is expensive. And expensive governance competes with national investment, and national investment is what you need to sustain power in a long rivalry. This is why the Alabama revolt is not a local story. It's a case study. It shows what happens when a political movement sells intensity but underdelivers stability. And it shows how quickly intensity turns inward when bills rise and services falter. Now add the international layer. The U.S. remains deeply involved in major global crises. Europe's security is under strain. The Indo-Pacific is tense. Alliances are being tested. Defense industrial bases are being stretched. And in that environment, domestic dysfunction becomes a multiplier of risk. Because when leaders feel politically trapped at home, they often look for external victories to stabilize their standing, to change the subject, to unify factions, to look strong. And that is how foreign policy becomes dangerously performative. The temptation is escalation by distraction. Louder threats, sharper rhetoric, bigger packages, bolder red lines, anything that makes the leader look decisive. But real strategy is the opposite. Real strategy is prioritization. And prioritization requires political discipline. And political discipline is hard when your own supporters are booing you out of town halls. That is the grim logic. The more domestic frustration grows, the more elites feel the urge to externalize, and the more they externalize, the more resources get pulled away from the domestic repairs that could reduce frustration. It becomes a feedback loop of weakness masquerading as strength. And so the rude awakening is not just for Trump or for one party. It is for the entire governing class that assumed polarization could be mined forever without consequence, that assumed outrage could replace policy, that assumed culture, war theater, could substitute for delivering the boring essentials of a functioning state. Because the essentials are what keep a society resilient: affordable access to health security, reliable infrastructure, honest budgeting, competent administration, stable markets for producers, predictable rules for consumers, and a political culture that treats citizens as stakeholders rather than targets. When those essentials slip, the state doesn't collapse overnight. It degrades, and degradation is the most dangerous condition of all because it creates uncertainty, and uncertainty invites miscalculation. If allies start doubting your reliability, they hedge. If rivals start doubting your resolve, they probe. And if your own citizens start doubting the value of the system, they withdraw consent in 1,000 ways, from disengagement to revolt. That is how empires crack, not with one dramatic explosion, but with accumulated small failures that produce a sudden public snap. Tonight, the lesson from Alabama is that the snap is no longer hypothetical. It's visible. It is visible in the anger of people who believed they were voting for strength and now feel they are living in fragility. It is visible in the inability of local and national leaders to answer basic questions. Why are costs rising? Why is coverage uncertain? Why is governance so unserious? Without retreating into slogans. And it is visible in the deeper strategic danger. When the world sees America struggling to govern itself, it does not automatically mean America is finished, but it does mean the margin for error shrinks. The next crisis abroad will arrive when domestic patience is thinner. The next demand on the defense budget will come when voters are angrier about their own bills. The next alliance decision will be made inside a political environment where every compromise is treated as betrayal. That is not how you win long competitions. That is how you drift into them without preparation. So, if you want the conclusion in realist terms, it's this. Alabama is not just a state story. It's a warning light on the dashboard of American power. A great power that cannot deliver basic stability at home will find it harder to sustain credibility abroad. And when credibility falters, rivals test limits, allies hedge, and the probability of escalation rises. Not because anyone wants war, but because the system rewards opportunism and punishes weakness. And the rude awakening in that town hall is the sound of citizens demanding a reordering of priorities, a demand that the political class stop treating governance like a stadium and start treating it like what it is, the management of national strength. If America wants to reduce the risk of global conflict, it has to rebuild its domestic foundation, not with theatrics, not with scapegoats, not with endless culture war adrenaline, but with policy that restores health security, economic predictability, institutional trust, and social cohesion, because in the end, the most powerful weapon in great power politics is not a tariff or a tweet or a foreign deployment. It is a stable, productive society whose citizens believe the system works for them. And tonight, in Alabama, you can hear what happens when that belief starts to break.